Thank you for joining Acrobatiq's Unlocking Learning with Cognitive Science, featuring Dr. Marsha Lovett. My name is Sharon Schwarzmiller, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's web event. If you have a Twitter account, feel free to tweet away and use hashtag Unlocking Learning. Clicking the arrows on the Grab tab of the rectangular box on the left-hand side of the control panel will open and close the control panel for you. To minimize audio issues, please make sure you've chosen the audio mode that corresponds to your setup. If listening via your computer or headset, click Use Mic or Speakers. And alternately, if you've called in or wish to call in by telephone, choose Use Telephone option. And of course, we're taking questions in today's session, so please make use of the Q&A text block on the panel to submit questions throughout the webinar so that Marsha can answer them for you when we get to the Q&A segment of our presentation. For those of you who submitted questions when you registered for the webcast, we'd like to thank you and let you know that Marsha is going to be addressing some of those questions throughout her presentation today. And then we actually pulled a couple of them to kick off the Q&A segment of the webinar and answer for the entire group. So thank you, and we'll get to that as we move through the order of events today, which is going to be as follows. At first, we're going to begin the webcast with this brief introduction of Marsha, which I'll do in a moment. Marsha is then going to ask all of you a few poll questions, which will appear on your monitor and you'll want to participate in. And then Marsha will then talk about her research for the next 20 or so minutes, and then we'll open up the session for your questions. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Marsha Lovett. Marsha has been studying and improving how students learn for more than 20 years. In addition to her role as Chief Learning Officer at Acrobatiq, she is Carnegie Mellon's Director of the Eberly College of Teaching Excellence and Educational Innovation, and a teaching professor in the Department of Psychology. She received her PhD in cognitive psychology from Carnegie Mellon, and later returned to join the psychology department faculty. Her early research focused on learning, memory, and problem solving, and she developed computational models of strategy selection, skill acquisition, and working memory. Over time, her work turned towards applying these models to real-world learning situations and translating that theory into educational practice. She's published more than 50 articles on learning and instruction, co-authored the book How Learning Works, 7 Research-Based Principles for Smart Teaching, and developed several innovative educational technologies, including StatTutor and the Learning Dashboard. We are so thrilled to have her with us today. So without further exposition, I will hand it over to Marsha to kick off today's webinar with a few poll questions.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's really my pleasure to be here to share a little bit of the work I've done and to see how that relates to some of the teaching and learning and technology issues that folks in this webinar might also be interested in. And to start it off, we do have a polling system here. I have been introduced, but I'd like to get a quick sense of the audience. So I'm wondering what you would take as your primary role or responsibility related to today's topic.
Okay, great, Marsha. We've got a lot of people submitting their answers to the poll.
Terrific. And I recognize that some folks may feel they play more than one of these roles, so you can pick the one that you think is the best fit. I probably would check all of the above. I bet there are a lot of folks like that too.
Okay, we have a fair amount, actually over 90% or so. So I'm going to close that poll and share the results for you.
Thanks.
And so everyone can see here that we have about 70% of our group has designated themselves as a professor, 14% as an administrator, other is 10%, and researcher and technologist came in at 3% apiece.
Terrific.
So I'm going to hide this one.
Thank you. Well, I actually have another question, and it really is one to kickstart our conversation today and what I'm hoping to talk about. That is, I'm wondering if folks in the audience feel like you've used results from cognitive science research in your teaching already. just based on what you think you may be doing already in your teaching. Do you think you're a yes, a no, or a not sure? So maybe just give that one a quick thought and enter your response, and Sharon can read out the results for us.
Perfect. Yep, we've got a lot of people weighing in right now. And I'll give it just 2 more seconds. And here we go. That's good. We have about 85% of our folks, or whoop, no, 86 last minute. I'm going to close this poll and I'll share the results. And it looks like, well, this is a nice split. So 52% of the participants here today have said yes, 6% have said no, and 42 have said they're not sure, maybe.
I'm glad I put that third option choice there. Thank you, Sharon. Well, and one of the reasons I put this question here is to get a sense of the audience and what folks already may be thinking about and incorporating into their teaching. I'm not surprised that this number is as high as it is, and in fact, 52% is absolutely amazing. I read a statistic not too long ago. It was not conducted at Carnegie Mellon, it was conducted elsewhere, and it was a few years ago, asking this similar question of college or university faculty members, and the percent of respondents who said yes was about 8%. So I think we have a pretty select and special group here. Nevertheless, I hope there's something for all of us to learn in what I have to talk about. And thanks everyone for answering that question. Speaking of cognitive science, I want to take a step back in time and talk about sort of my intellectual heritage, but also Carnegie Mellon's history in cognitive science. And I have some pictures from the archives here. On the left is Herb Simon and Alan Newell. These folks in the mid 20th century were actually some of the founders, especially Herb Simon, of the field of cognitive science, where for the first time issues and questions like human thought, learning, logic, problem solving were really exposed as areas of scientific inquiry. What I think Herb Simon and Alan Newell did that was quite remarkable is not only did they promote this idea that we could empirically investigate these aspects of the mind, thinking and learning, but that the computer, which was also around that time being developed and a lot of active work going on, was viewed as a possible tool for those scientific explorations. So I have a really big computer on the right of the era, and the idea that these folks at this time were exploring was, well, if we want to have scientific theories about these very complex topics, we're going to need some pretty sophisticated tools. And the developments in computer science and artificial intelligence really helped move that forward. And also, I think the direction of support went the other way, is that what we were starting to learn about the human brain and mind helped inspire some thinking about the computer as a metaphor for mind. And this was the beginnings of an era where a lot of work went involved in developing what I like to call computational models. That is a theory of cognitive psychology, how something about the human mind or learning works that's not just spoken in words, but that's actually implemented in a running computer program. And the real value of this from a scientific point of view is that if your theory is written up in a computer program, well, you can use that program to generate predictions about what human data you will find when you run different experiments or observe people in different learning situations. And so this was a really powerful tool for the field to really push forward the theoretical development and also then test and make sure that those theories matched the data. So this was really important in sort of a theoretical sense, but at Carnegie Mellon and around other places, the idea was that we didn't want this just to be an abstract theoretical move, but rather if we really thought these theories and these computer models had some truth behind them, we could put them to the test in real world contexts. And this is when more in the 70s and 80s, moving into the 90s, these computer models were used behind the scenes of cognitive tutors or personal tutors on the computer that would help students learn to problem solve in different areas of mathematics or computer science or maybe physics. And the way they worked is that the student would be solving a problem in the computer interface. Behind the scenes, the computer model would both be able to solve that problem with artificial intelligence and then match up what the cognitive model said about what the student might be doing to better interpret the student's moves and be able to give some hints and feedbacks tailored to what the student was doing or answering. And all this is to say that it was a really nice development in that we had the research, basic research practice and theoretical developments really informing and being informed by some educational applications that matter. In terms of these math tutors, it was really helping students who were perhaps struggling in regular classroom experiences. And there are a lot of studies that showed that. What I want to do is actually give a case study from my own work on how the role of computer models and theories of how learning works can be put into real-world contexts and really make a difference in student learning outcomes. That is part of what we're doing today, and I think really moving forward even beyond some of the early beginnings of cognitive science that I talked about just now. And the study I want to talk about was conducted in the context of an introductory Carnegie Mellon statistics course. In this course, traditionally, it was taught in a lecture mode where students would, for the full semester, go to lecture, and then once a week they would actually attend a computer lab session where they got hands-on practice. So traditional should really be conceived of in a rather updated form of a traditional college course, at which you could say these students spent 100 hours or more learning and solving problems, but when we did a pre-post test of their learning gains, we found only 3% increase. And sadly enough, that 3% was not significantly different from zero. So a lot of time spent with rather little gain. Around this time, we had been developing an online statistics course within the Open Learning Initiative platform, and we built it in such a way that it was data-driven from cognitive science principles and also had some additional data-driven technologies built in, and we wanted to see how much we could move the needle above that situation with the traditional course. And so we call this our adaptive data-driven course. And the results we found were based on a study where we had students cover the same material, but in a mini semester. That is in about half as many weeks. And we did the same pre-post test to see what students' learning gain would be. The result is that in under 50 hours, so much less than half the time, students' learning gain was significantly greater than in the original case, in the standard course. And it was such a positive result. We wanted to double check it, as good scientists, and so I should say that we replicated this 3 times at Carnegie Mellon in slightly different situations, and the result was picked up by others in the higher ed community, so much so that the Ithaca group conducted a clinical trial in state schools and several, I think 7 different sites to replicate these results again outside the Carnegie Mellon context. I set that up as a sort of starting point for conversation because what I really want to talk about in this time we have together is what actually explains the transition between these 2 modes of teaching and learning. And I think one of the themes is that it's using the learning data effectively that really helps to explain the benefit of that adaptive data-driven OLI course. So let me just tell you a little bit about how that learning data can be used, and then I'll give you some specific examples. So the student learning data that we have in this course can, in one sense, be used to help student performance. So if the students are interacting with the system, that system can then feed back to them answers on questions they might have if they ask for a hint, or give them feedback when they make a mistake. That's a lot like the cognitive tutors that I mentioned earlier. There are some other ways that the student learning data can actually help students that I'll be talking about in this presentation that go above and beyond that. It's also worth noting that in early OLI courses and a lot of other online platforms, the data were there, but they were actually not being shared with the instructor. And so what we've done in some of the work that I've done here at Carnegie Mellon with Acrobatiq as well is find ways to use that student learning data, leverage it so the instructor's activities can be adapted, made more effective and more efficient. I'll focus on those, but I don't want to leave out the two other feedback loops on this diagram. One is that the student learning data can actually improve course design. So the more you find that students struggle in a particular area of an online course, or actually are doing really well and don't need all that practice and perhaps be given more challenging problems, things like that can be derived from analysis of the data and improve course design. And then, as I said earlier, I think it's a really nice opportunity for the field work, the getting student learning data in real world learning situations to feed the cycle of discovery in the science of learning. So let me dig right in to what I mean by the cognitive science that can help in our analyses of these learning data. There are a lot of mechanisms that are rather well understood in terms of how people learn and solve problems. I've listed a few of them here. These mechanisms are part of what those computational models have been refined to test and predict over the years since Alan Newell and Herb Simon started this area. I'm going to tell you about one of these mechanisms called the power law of learning, and I hope it'll resonate with your experience in teaching. So the power law of learning states that as students practice, that is, as you go across to the right on the x-axis, their performance improves. That is, the error rate here I've shown on the y-axis goes down, but it does so in such a way that there are marginally decreasing returns. So you can see that early on a little bit of practice makes a big difference, but later on less so. This is a very robust phenomenon, so much so that it's a powerful diagnostic. When we don't see a pattern of learning like this, it tells us something interesting and maybe something wrong is going on. Now, I'm going to show you a picture that is absolutely not matching that power law of learning curve. And the reason I said this might resonate is I'm wondering if folks in the audience have ever seen, as you know, maybe you wouldn't have called it a learning curve, but if you've ever seen a curve in your students' work that looks as bumpy as this one. And so I want you to think back to your experiences if that's happened. If I could ask you, Sharon, to pull up the poll again, and folks to think about, well, based on your experience or even just guessing, what do you think might explain this bumpy learning curve? So the first one I have in mind is, well, maybe this power law of learning just doesn't hold for statistics. Maybe the students were tired by problem number 6. Maybe that problem was confusing. That was the data point on the right where the error rate went really high. Or maybe problem 6 was different from the rest in some way, in difficulty or the skills required, etc. If we were all face-to-face, I'd ask for folks to share an additional set of ideas they have, but I think for purposes of this webinar, I'll ask folks to just chime in. Which do you think of these 4 might be the explanation?
Now we have about 50-some% of the folks who voted, so everyone's still considering the answers, I think, Marsha. But
Sure, maybe just wait a few more seconds and then we can see where we are, and I can continue from there.
Oh, we're slowing down.
That
Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, let me go ahead. I'll close this up at about almost 80% here have given us their opinion. So let me close this up and push it for you all and share the results. So what explains this bumpy learning curve? 5% said the power law of learning doesn't hold for statistics. 32% said the students were tired by problem 6. 37% said problem 6 was confusing. And an overwhelming, we'll say, 65% said the problem 6 was different from the rest in difficulty or skill.
Now I note that those sum to more than 100, so it sounds like folks were able to select more than one item. And I actually think that is probably the answer here. And you know, it's a good example of how when we're dealing with human learners, it's usually not just one thing that's going on. Let me show you another layer on that data set I just showed, and we can talk about how this might be explained in the case I showed you. I think all of these are interesting ones to discuss. But here's a little overlay. So it turns out that when you look at the problems that students were practicing in this statistics course, the first three involved interpreting a histogram. The fourth and fifth involved interpreting a table, and the sixth involved interpreting a box plot, a kind of statistical analysis visualization that was rather new to students. So when you look at the graph with this in mind, you can really see that, well, it kind of makes sense that there would be that blip at problem 6, and maybe students came in with a little more experience interpreting tables and so forth. This leads to one of the most important aspects of that power law of learning, and that is the idea that students' practice improves skill by skill. So what I've done in this graph is I've actually reorganized the same data points so that the first opportunity for practice on a given skill is lined up against the 1 and the second against the 2 and so forth, so that you can see that, well, when you look at the data that way, the power law of learning, I'll average over these, actually seems to be revealed when we do that. And this is just one little example of the idea that the power law of learning really relates to students' practice at particular skills. So when a student practices a particular skill, it's their performance at that skill that improves with marginally decreasing returns. Other skills are not affected, and that's really hard for faculty members to appreciate, I think, because we often suffer from what I like to call the expert's blind spot, in that we see a field of inquiry as, you know, all these skills are so combined in our minds. We can easily forget that students need to learn these complex aspects of performance by bit, maybe chunk by chunk, and then putting those chunks together. So one way of thinking about it is, then, if you're not paying attention to the skills you want your students to learn, you may be missing something fundamental. And that's just one of the many results from cognitive science that we can apply to think about technology-enhanced learning. In terms of the application of the power law of learning, I think one of the key implications is that we really want to make sure we're aligning the practice we give to students with the skills we know they need to learn. And so how did that implication or principle or guideline play into the result that I showed you at the beginning of this webinar? Well, it turns out that in building that course, that online course, there was a lot of planning work, like I'm sure you're familiar with when you think about designing a course, and especially in designing technology-enhanced learning resources. You want to plan ahead. What we did is we really encouraged the content experts to analyze the learning context according to the target skills. And he started in the best place as possible, but the first run of the course, then we had data that we could analyze and look at those learning curves. So having done that, we actually found some learning curves that were nice and smooth, and it looked like the practice was well aligned with what students needed to improve. There were also several skills where when we looked at the learning data, they were not fitting that pattern. Maybe it was because there weren't enough practice opportunities. Maybe it was because the activities that students were practicing were actually not exactly targeting the same skill that the course author thought. And here are some examples of areas in the course where we found these bumpy learning curves. What that enabled us to do, that analysis of the learning data, enabled the course designers, some content experts and instructional designers, to actually target their efforts. And so what they did is they added practice opportunities just where the learning data indicated they would get and students would get the most bang for the buck. And so that, I think, is a really nice example of using learning data to improve instructional design or course design. It's part of a larger set of ideas that are in the book that Sharon mentioned, that myself and some current and former colleagues wrote about different principles of how learning works that can really inform our teaching. And so these principles we took from a broad variety of literatures, and we also made sure that the research we were drawing on would be relevant to real classrooms and to a variety of disciplinary domains, students, and contexts, and think about, okay, if we had to distill this down to some key aspects of how learning works and mechanisms of learning that would have implications for teaching, what would they be? And this really then relates to another aspect of the course design that I talked about. It was really built on this idea that not just any practice is going to be as effective as other. And I like to use this little saying that practice perfect is what makes perfect, not just any old practice. So this picture shows one of the principles from that book that indicates it's practice in part of a cycle of giving students practice that's directed by the goal, that is, it's aligned with the goal. The observed performance that students do as a result of that practice allows for the key part of this cycle, which is feedback. And so it's through giving feedback to the students that we can refine that practice, make it more targeted and personalized. And this is another aspect that was built into the situation I talked about, in the study I talked about. In the current situation, or the traditional situation, shall I say, students would do their homework, turn it in, and then days later receive graded papers. I think it's pretty common that when students get back their papers, they focus on the grade. By then, the lecture or the class has already moved on to the next topic, so there's not much incentive to remediate. What we really want is something where there's timely feedback to students when they're in the midst of learning, feedback that helps them not only get that question right, but that identifies larger patterns of strength and weakness and then promotes their better learning overall. And that's where we actually built in some tools into the course that was the adaptive data-driven course. We provide repeated practice that's aligned with the target skills, as I said, but each of those practice opportunities is built in such a way that it offers personalized feedback, and in addition, picks up on what the student is doing to give the learning data in an analyzed form to instructors so they can appropriately adapt their teaching. Here's how we built that into the study. So in the adaptive accelerated online course, students would see activities kind of like this one. So they're given a question, maybe in this case they have to fill in a blank. When they select a given answer, they get feedback right there. You can also see that if they were stuck, they could request a hint and then get some help on that level. This is a way to give the students feedback item by item, but it also has another advantage, and that is that students, given the interactions with the system, then we have data on students' error patterns, how long it's taking them to answer questions, what they're answering, and so forth, that can be analyzed using the power law of learning and other cognitive theoretical ideas, and then summarized in a way like this display in the lower right to tell the instructor at a glance, how is my class doing? Where do they need help? Where are they doing fine and we can move on? And that's really been a key part of the work I've been doing in thinking about how can we use the data best to leverage the instructor so the instructor's time is spent most effectively, and the technology is just part of that instructor's larger role in teaching students. One of the questions I should add that came in from a participant in the registration phase was, are we satisfied with the nature and the amount and so forth of feedback in this course? And I guess I should say, well, I'm never satisfied, but at the same time, I think the features that are built into this course are really effective. There's the ones that I would hope you'd all be looking for whenever you're adopting technology enhanced learning resource. That is, that students are interacting with the system in a way that they can get immediate feedback, that feedback is tailored to their response in a way that it can guide that individual student if they've shown a misconception or they've shown a pattern of behavior where they can get some extra support. Also, ideally, these activity types that enable practice and feedback allow for multiple kinds of interaction. And in the statistics course, we have a full range of interactions from uh, interactively watching a video, stopping and starting it, answering multiple choice kind of comprehension check questions, answering more open-ended questions and comparing your answer to a model answer, and then all the way to actually completing a full data analysis exercise, getting intermediate feedback along the way. So I think we're in a really good place with that. Of course, we can always strive for better. So just to give you a sense of beyond the practice and feedback principle, there are many other enduring principles of learning that are one can draw from the research reflected in some of those things that are in the book I mentioned, but also that I think we really see in the best work that's out there, like the statistics course that's now in Acrobatiq's catalog, but also some of the other work that that's out there. Um, so in this regard, I really think it's important to realize that it's not about the technology necessarily, it's not about the content, but learning results from what the student does and thinks, and only from what the student does and thinks. The teacher, and I would add, the technology can advance learning only by influencing what the student does to learn. This is a quote, actually, that Herb Simon was fond of saying in reminding us all that we need to think about the learner first. And with that, I think I'll go to the first question. This is from someone at Cloud State University. And I think it's a really good one because it fits with the theme I had, and it's acknowledging that, there's a lot of learning data. You've probably heard this idea of big data and, learning analytics. It's out there. And there is a lot of potential, but there also are perils. I've highlighted that you can use these kinds of learning data really effectively in leveraging what the learner knows about him or herself in terms of strengths and weaknesses, also in helping the instructor or administrators or course designers appropriately adapt what they're doing to further promote and enhance students' learning. What I think makes that most effective in the work I've done is that the data are not just pushed through a black box of data analysis, but they're analyzed in a way that is sensitive to what we know about how learning works and what we know about the content domain. And that's really where I think you see a lot of the benefits. So that the modeling and results coming out of models of that kind of data set can really be informative and diagnostic and useful. There are perils, though. I think one of the things that often happens is that the quality of results you get are dependent on the data coming in. There's the garbage in, garbage out kind of idea. I think there's also potentially a risk, and this is me putting my scientific hat on, that it's easy to calculate a mean or to calculate a comparison between two observable quantities, but there are a lot of questions about what explains those differences and what best actions to take. So I think in all of this we need to think about that. And then I think as this question was raised, there are also perils in terms of the privacy of data and security and so forth, and those are all issues that we should be considering in parallel. Last other question I wanted to address is, this came in from someone else in the registration period, Amit. Why do students keep playing games to improve their skills when they fail so often? And how can that be translated to teaching in the classroom? So first of all, I thought this was an interesting one because there is a lot of interest in gamification of education these days, and it's certainly the case. I don't know if you have friends or family that a lot of people's time these days is spent playing games. Um, the highlight I would like to add here is that just any time on task is not necessarily going to lead to the best learning and improvement. So what I like to focus in on is there has been some research done on games where the actual keeping on playing even in spite of failure leads to good learning outcomes. And in those cases, the nice thing that we're finding in the research is that the features of those games have a lot in common with the features of the best learning environments. So really it's a matter of seeing what those common features are and trying to find ways to bring them into the classroom. I think one of the things that I elided over quickly in terms of that practice and feedback cycle that's a very important aspect of what makes perfect practice is appropriate level of challenge. And I think that's something that games do very well in having levels and having grounded feedback right in the system that helps improvement. I think the more we can bring those features into our teaching, probably the better.
Okay, Marsha, well, thank you for going through a couple of those questions that came in during registration. We have had some questions come in while you were talking. So are you ready to have us kind of give you a couple of those now?
You bet.
Okay, so I'm going to start with this one. This one is from someone by the name of Lorraine. And Lorraine asks, what was most of this research done with high school or college students, or was it also done with adult learners?
Great question. The research that I talked about, that particular study, was with Carnegie Mellon undergraduates taking a course that's at the introductory level. So they were mainly underclass students, first year and second years. The Ithaca group study that followed up on it was conducted at a variety of other universities, some big state schools, also undergraduate students. It is the case that there's been a lot of other work done in this area. The cognitive tutors work has been done on middle school and high school students, as well as some undergraduates. And I think now that these educational technologies are moving more broadly into job training and adult learners, learners going back to pick up new skills or get additional studies, we'll be seeing more and more of it in the adult learning as well.
Great, thank you. Here's another question that came in from Anthony. Is there a danger that by focusing on specific skills, we are just providing skills to pass a test and not teaching students to think for themselves? Or does the evidence show they develop these critical thinking skills also?
I'm so glad that came up. Um, I should have said a few caveats at the beginning. When I say that, I think that we need to keep in mind the exact elements that Anthony's raising about bringing these skills together, integrating them into complex critical thinking, problem solving, and so forth. The approach that I take is not to forget about that, and I sort of almost take it for granted that that's the goal, is to promote students to those higher order thinking skills. What I think is really important is that in planning the sequencing and the activities and practice and feedback students get, it can be very helpful to unpack what are some of the sub skills in something like critical thinking in a particular discipline, to give students some practice at the pieces, but then make sure that you also give them practice putting those pieces together. So I am not at all saying that we want to just drill students on the specific skills, but rather keep the skill analysis in the back of our minds, regardless of whether for a given student or class they really need help on the specific skills, or we want to focus on that integration and application, which is just as important and probably all the more challenging given the diversity of contexts to which students need to apply what they've learned.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all of you who are submitting questions right now. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. I will move to the next one, which was submitted by Jason. Thank you, Jason. To what extent do you believe the system mimics the best practices of in-person tutoring?
That's a very nice question. So I actually have done a little bit of research on the power and effectiveness of one-on-one human tutoring. And this research started before my day with the result that used to show the only way to really show significant learning gains, two standard deviation learning gains over a classroom, was one-on-one tutoring. Um, with the advent of the cognitive tutors that I talked about, we have shown in many cases that the technology, when it has this interactive, personalized feedback, um, it can achieve learning gains around the level of one-on-one human tutoring. The features that are most helpful in human tutoring, I think, tie into what I was talking about a lot here. One is that immediacy of the feedback and the diagnosis of where the problem areas are. Um, Another is, in some sense, some of the work that I did long, long ago. Now you're having me dredge up research from long, long ago, is that one of the real values of a human tutor is that they are sitting there while the student is actually doing, while the student is solving a problem or wrangling with a reading and trying to interpret it. And they're there making the opportunity for the student to be doing and constructing. And so I think in that regard, many of the examples I gave today embody that, in that there are interactive activities where students are prompted not just to passively consume, read a video or read a passage or watch a video, but they're asked actually to do something. And I think that's probably the crux of it.
Very good, very good. William, I'd like to read your question now. This one is interesting to me. William says, I teach history, so my students aren't looking at problem sets. They are learning sensitive interpretation of texts. And that's hard to quantify or get week by week feedback. What do you recommend when feedback loops are subjective and slow?
Oh, great question. Well, one of the tools that I think is really useful is something some of you might have heard about, called a rubric. A rubric is a sort of, it's an instructional tool, you might say. Some people think of it as a grading tool, but I actually think of it as a teaching learning tool as much as an assessment tool. Here's what a rubric is. It's kind of a table where each row in the table is a different quality or dimension that you value and you want to communicate to students. It's something that they should be paying attention to in their work. So that's each row. In a written assignment, it might be good organization, coherent flow, or something like that. The columns in the table then are different levels of quality, and so that means that a given cell would be saying, for coherence of argument or coherence of organization, um, excellent performance may be described this way, and that would be written up in that cell, all the way down to poor performance or a low level of quality of that feature would look like this. And then what you're doing is you're actually being a little more precise and kind of operationalizing what it means for what good performance on each of the features you're interested in and you want students to learn looks like. Rubrics tend to make the assessment and the feedback more reliable. That is, students would get the same response from different judges when the judges are using a rubric. And it's also the case that giving the rubric to the students in advance can help them focus their efforts where you want to, which is, again, getting back to that practice that's directed by the goal. There is a pitfall of rubrics, I have to be open, and that is it takes some time to get them right, to get them so it works for you as an instructor and works for you as your students. Um, but working through that investment, I think it often pays off in the long run. And it is worth noting that if you think about those rows in a rubric, they kind of correspond to some skills or skill areas that you really want to give students practice on and feedback on. So it really is consistent with the research I was talking about today.
Great. Okay, so let's take another question. This one here is from Virginia. Virginia asks, how does one balance the notion of learning from failure, another idea supported by cognitive science research, with the notion of perfect practice makes perfect?
Could you say that one again? I'm sorry.
Sure, sure. So how does one balance the notion of learning from failure, which is another idea supported by cognitive science research, with the notion that you had talked about of perfect practice makes perfect?
Yes, and in that I didn't mean perfect that the students must do it right, but that the practice has been designed to really target what the students need. I've actually not talked a lot in this session today about motivation, and I think motivation is one of the areas where this aspect of productive failure or learning from failure is really tricky because students, I think much more than faculty, fear failure. And so I think giving students low stakes practice where taking a risk is not only okay, but it's encouraged, and the feedback is really viewed as an opportunity not just to be evaluated, can you do it or not, but what can we learn from your first try? And so I think that those ideas can definitely tie into what I've been talking about. And I think also bring in a lot of other very important considerations like motivation, students' feeling of efficacy, appropriate level of challenge, and so forth.
James submitted a question to us, and it's kind of related to kind of the feedback that the program gives um, on the kind of misconception that's made. What he asks is, how do you provide immediate feedback that is tailored to the student's specific difficulties? It would seem that immediate feedback would be pre-programmed and not highly customized to each student.
I'll tell you a simple example. Maybe it's the simplest way to explain it that will give us a start. So let's imagine there is a question that students are asked to answer, and it's multiple choice, kind of like the one that I showed as a sample. It can be the case that particular options that are in the multiple choices are set up as distractors. That is, as sort of smoking gun, that a certain misconception is present in students' mind. In cognitive science, we have a name for these misconceptions. Sometimes we call them buggy skills. Like there's a bug in the program, there's a buggy skill out there. And so we can actually design the questions so that there's an easier way to diagnose. We can then tie the feedback to the particular response options. That's just the simplest way we can do this. With the kind of modeling I talked about, and I think this is where not all systems are at this level, but this is the kind of work that we've been doing lately with the Learning Dashboard as part of my work, is to take patterns of students' behavior in addition to just one item, one response, but look for patterns of behavior that may be consistent with a particular misconception, and then have the system trigger a response, a pedagogical response to go with that.
Okay, Marsha, we're just going to take a couple more. This one is from Teresita, and she asks, at what point would the results indicate a need for faculty to revisit or reconsider teaching strategies, or to provide multiple ways of teaching a particular or desired skill?
Great. So one of the things I spoke about quickly was that instructor dashboard that can show at a glance where your students' progress is in their learning. I'll just give a couple examples to give a feel for, hopefully this addresses your question. One thing is that dashboard can have, for each of the learning objectives, it kind of gives a sense of where students are in their learning state. Have they learned a lot? Have they mastered? Does it appear they've mastered that learning objective? Are they kind of on path to and they're doing okay? Or are they struggling? And so what that at a glance view can show is where you might want to focus your efforts if you had time for a mini lecture in the next day's class, or you wanted to adjust your lecture to focus in on something that was the students' areas of struggle. It may also suggest that instead of lecturing at all, you may want to look for problems that students could do in small groups that would give them a chance to exercise or practice that when you, the teacher, are there to give them the support they need. And in fact, the kinds of interfaces that we've been working with allow an instructor in advance of class to drill down and look at, well, what were the particular answers, wrong answers, say, that led to the students showing that they were not mastering this particular skill, and that could actually guide the instructor in finding good additional practice problems.
Well, outstanding. Thank you so much, Marsha. That's the last question that we're going to have time for today. However, we'll do our best to answer all of the questions that we did not have time to answer live, and we'll email you a response within a week. We'd also like to invite you to help us make improvements by providing feedback in a very short 3-question survey that's going to pop up after we end this presentation today. But we'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar, Unlocking Learning with Cognitive Science. Also, just a reminder that this webinar will be available for you on demand starting tomorrow. And we'll also be providing the slides for you, so please watch your inbox for details. So a sincere thank you, Marsha.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah, and to all of you for taking time out of your day to participate. I'm Sharon Schwarzmiller. Have a great day.